The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, folks. This is Travis McGrath. Welcome to another series of the Exago Technical Support Labs. I'm joined by my colleagues today, Emma Williams and Alex Agoda, who will be answering questions. So in the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar panel, if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to type them in there. I already see a few folks writing in yes, which is a good indicator that they can hear me, which is great. So what we're going to talk about today is a new feature in our version 17.2, 2017.2, I should say, and it's a new way to launch Exago. So this is going to be a pretty technical lab. We're going to go into some code, but don't worry, I'm not going to crack open Visual Studio. We've written some simple examples that we're going to show here. So our JavaScript API is the topic of the day, and the first question we're going to look at is, what are the benefits of the JavaScript API? So the JS API is a new way to launch Exago. Simply put, it's just like the REST or the .NET API, and all it really does is let you specify to launch the full UI, the scheduler, or directly into executing various reports. But there are a few benefits and a few differences. So first, the benefits. Because of the way the JS API is architected, it's going to use fewer resources on your server if you're launching Exago into multiple sessions for a particular user. So for example, if you have a page in your host application and you're embedding multiple reports, that normally through the .NET or the REST service would use multiple sessions for each report, one for each report. The JS API can have one session and then execute each of those reports individually using that same set of permissions. Beyond that, you can embed Exago without using an iframe. Now, of course, there are some benefits. There's some pros and cons to iframes, but if you do want to move to other types of containers, simple divs is going to be the example we use. Of course, that's now going to be supported through the JS API. And because you're embedding Exago and without use of an iframe, you'll have access to Exago's DOM. Now, this, of course, has some possibilities for conflicts with things like CSS. We've changed our CSS classes, so there shouldn't be any conflicts there. But it gives you greater possibility for extensibility, because from the host application, you can navigate Exago's DOM, you could insert buttons or items or actions beyond the existing action events. We're not going to go into those sort of more complex theoretical cases. We're just going to show some of the base cases here today. So a question came up, which is, what's the DOM? And so that's a DOM is the sort of listing of components on a web page. So as you build out an HTML page, the DOM is the elements that exist within it. Great. So beyond the benefits, how does the JavaScript API work? And the concept here, so the concept here is going to be that there's two steps, the authorization and then the launch. And normally in using the .NET or the REST service, these would be done both on the server in essentially the same set of code, right? They would happen in order, but the same code would be doing both authorization and launch. So of course, this still tenant to Exago's integration is going to let the host application authenticate the user and decide when to launch Exago. But the way authorization is going to work is in the server side, in the host application, in whatever language you're using, right? So if you're in a .NET environment like C#, which our example today is going to be, you would use the current existing .NET API. Or if you're in another language, you would use the REST-based web service to authorize a session, that is to say, to start a session. But then instead of having the .NET or the REST service launch Exago, what it's going to do is it's going to store a value. We'll show that more in a second. And then it's going to leave the launch to JavaScript on the client side. So from the host application in the browser, there will be elements that will then initialize and call Exago to launch a report or launch the full UI. So the launch is now going to happen client side using JavaScript, and it's going to load from a library that, of course, is provided as part of the installation, and use that to launch Exago. So that's sort of the key concept, is that we've now separated that launch. So the authorization. What this is going to do is initially, we're just going to instantiate Exago and set the permissions just like we did in previous iterations of using the .NET and the Web Service API. If you're not as familiar with those two APIs, we just did a support lab on that last month. So on our support site, you can always go check out. Of course, all of our support labs are recorded here. And so what either the web service or the .NET API is going to do is it's going to start a session with an API session for the user. It's going to set all of their parameters, their roles, their access, any settings or languages that you want to change for that particular user. It's going to set all of those permissions. But unlike previously, it's not going to load a specific report or set what we call the API action to tell Exago, when you launch, you're going to open up the scheduler, or you're going to directly execute a report. It's not going to set these, and instead, it's going to store a launch key or two keys. So it's not going to set these values, and instead of launching by calling get URL param string, it's going to use a set of property called web reports base URL, and it's going to call a method called get API key. And this API key is what's going to be used by the JavaScript to launch Exago. So then we've set everything up on the server as we first maybe loaded the page or whenever is appropriate. And now we want the buttons on the UI to launch Exago. So what they're going to do is they're going to take that API key that was stored from the server, and when everything is finished loading, it's going to call the JavaScript method. And there are a couple of different JavaScript methods depending on what you want to do. So there's a load full UI, execute report, schedule report wizard. There's a number of methods here. They're all going to be, of course, listed on our knowledge base, but they're going to mirror the API actions that you're used to with the .NET and the REST-based web service for the different types of ways to launch Exago. And all these methods critically are going to say where to launch Exago, so what container on the page. Now, of course, you could still use an iframe if you wanted to, but in our example, we're going to use a div. It's just another type of HTML element that builds a page. So with those theoretical concepts in place, I want to pause and just make sure there are any questions, but then we'll jump into code. Okay, I don't see any questions popping up, so we'll hop right into the code. And we're going to start on the server side. So from the server, when the page first loads, there's of course our protected page load method here. And we're just going to tell it to run Exago. We can call this method really whatever we want. But our run Exago method is down here below. And we're using the .NET API. This example is in C#, but it's going to be very similar to what the REST API would look like. So in the .NET API, we're going to instantiate an API object. We're going to call it API. And we're going to get a new API object, and we're going to tell it where to find the Exago installation. Now, of course, you may install Exago somewhere slightly differently. This is something that you can set up on your application. And we're going to keep track of the property, the web reports base URL property. And this is just the URL we've set up for Exago. So a great question came up, which was, what are the prerequisite server-side setup required for the JS API? So there aren't any special requirements. As you'll see in a second, we are going to register a particular script file. But in terms of setting up Exago installation-wise, all you have to do is update to 17.2. There's no special requirements there in setting it up. So we're going to instantiate the API object and set this base path. We'll use this later on. And then we're going to register the JavaScript on the page. So to do that, we're making a reference here to the base path plus WR script resource.axt, right? So this is going to be our our page that loads all the JavaScript for us. And in our container, so from the server, we're going to set some attributes that are going to be stored as values over on the client. Now, if you want to, of course, you could store these however you'd like, but we're just keeping track of 3. So we're keeping track of the URL, that is Exago's URL, an API key, and here we're calling this method API key, and a report name. This is if we want to directly launch a report, this is the name of that report. Now, of course, this could be more dynamic, but we're trying to keep the example as simple here as possible. And to that end, I should note we have a comment in our code that says this is the place where you would set parameter and role values, but we've skipped that here just for simplicity. So from the server side, this is really all the code we have to write. We just instantiated the object, loaded some script, and then we stored a few values for use over on the client side, most critically, our get API key. So now we can look at the client side, that is to say the actual HTML and JavaScript. And of course, normally in a robust application, you would write your JavaScript, not necessarily in line of the HTML. But for this example, I wanted everything to be in context. So we're starting with our basic HTML head, title, tags. But then we're going to get into the script. And this is what is really going to matter. So we start out by creating an API variable. We're going to load this in just a moment. And as the page loads, we're going to call this function, load JavaScript API. And what that does is it searches the page for a container. And so long as that container is found, of course, if the container is not found, we want to not try to use it. So when that container is found, we're going to retrieve the API key that we stored from the server, as well as the URL for Exago. And then we're going to use the Exago JavaScript library that we registered and loaded from the server side to instantiate a new API object. So we're calling this Exago API method. And to it, we're passing 3 things. We're passing the URL, we're passing the API key, and then once the Exago API is loaded, so this Exago session is loaded, we're passing it the next JavaScript method it should call. In this case, we're calling a method. We're not going to actually show the code for it here, but it's called show launch buttons. As you might suspect, that's going to show the buttons on the page that will launch Exago. The last thing we need to do to keep in mind here is as we're setting up the Exago session on the client, we're going to set a property, an API dot on our API object called onDisposeContainer. And this is a property that if Exago needs to exit, it knows what JavaScript function to call to get rid of the container so that you're not sort of leaving it sitting in perpetuity. We've just defined a simple method here called reset container. So reset container, we'll start out by showing that one here. Very easily just takes a container and says if that container exists, set its inner HTML to new, right? You could do some more sophisticated things, but this one seems easy. Beyond that, we're defining a few other JavaScript functions. So one is called show report, and this is going to find the container that we want to show Exago inside of, find the name of the report, so we stored that earlier from the server, and then on that API object that we've instantiated as our page loaded, we're going to execute the report. So there's a method here called API.executeReport. We tell it where to put the report once it's executed, that is to say our div, what format to output Exago to, so this could be HTML to see the viewer, or PDF, or Excel, or RTF, the name of the report, so the report path, and then we have another property here for some additional capabilities. Similar to show report, we can call on that API object, we have a show full UI. This is going to launch the full Exago UI. And in here, again, we find the container. And then our API object has a method called loadFullUI. Tried to make these as easily named as possible. And it just tells Exago where to load, what container to load into. So these are going to be our two methods that actually launch Exago. Now within the body of the HTML page, as it first loads, we're going to call that method we defined just a moment ago to set everything up. Now for our page, we have a couple of divs. One is going to have two buttons, one button called Show Report and one button called Full UI. As you might expect, one of them is going to launch a report, and the other is going to pull up the full Exago UI. And then the other div is going to be the container that Exago is going to sit inside. So this is a very bare bones example, but it pretty quickly defined and instantiated an API from the server, stored those values, and then retrieved them as the page was loaded, and then used those to launch Exago inside of a div here. So I want to pause and see if there are any questions. So a great question came up about recommendations to persist state if you're reusing a page, you wish to toggle between different sessions or reports. So you could certainly do that. I think for those recommendations, there are some in the in our knowledge base. There's some great articles on using state servers, as well as within the JavaScript API, some recommendations there. So I'll show that article in just a moment so you can see some of those recommendations and resources. So before we go on, I just want to show, so what we'll do is we'll jump over here to a little sample application that's running the code we just showed. Of course, this one's a little more sophisticated as it takes a user and sets some permissions. But what I can show is that when I, let me reload the page as it may have timed out as I was talking. So what it's going to do here is it instantiated the session. So during that brief pause there, it set up Exago. Now it showed me our two buttons, and I can click one and it will launch Exago into our div. And so that's sort of the JavaScript API in action. It's coming directly from these buttons. So I just want to pause there again and see if there are any questions. Okay, so a couple of questions came in. So one was, what is the lifetime of the API key? I believe the lifetime of the API key is going to be set by the, the lifetime of the API key is going to be set as the same of the server session. So that's something that can be configured within Exago settings. And another question came in that says, does the report button pull up a list of reports? So this example doesn't. The report button here calls the show report method, which is just going to execute a single report. But of course, this is a very basic example. You certainly could have a a button that pulls up a list, or you could just have a list of reports, and then each of those reports individually could call this execute report method, passing in a different report name here. Great. So I want to do one more thing. What I want to do here is just briefly pull up Exago's support site, our knowledge base. So exagosupport.com. Of course, this is where you can see all the video tutorials and labs that we record. But if you search for JavaScript API as a place to find more resources, if you have any subsequent questions after the lab, You can search for JS API, and of course that top link is a great article, has a lot of the examples and more in-depth notes as we go. So with that, the last thing I want to do here is just mention next month's labs. So in January, after the new year, we're going to have 2 topics. So on the 10th, our end user lab, my colleague Emma is going to be showcasing our document templates feature. And then on the 24th, our services team will be looking at stored procedures, when to use them, pros and cons, best practices, things like that. Now, at the end of every lab, we, through GoToWebinar, always have a feedback survey. And in January, what we're going to do is start putting, at the end of that survey on the 10th, we're going to put a couple of options for February's lab. So if you are interested in voting on what topics we should do next, both for our end user and technical topics, we want to get feedback for that. So we'll have both a suggestions option, so you can put in some freeform suggestions, but we'll probably have 1 or 2 or 3 options for you to vote on, and that will determine what February lab topics we cover. So a great question, so the tech question came in here, so I'll back up for a moment, which says, how does the API session link to a .NET session, and can they expire concurrently? So that's a very interesting question. I think you would have to configure them to expire concurrently. If you're hosting within the same session and not, launching Exago into a pop-up or another page, then of course your main page expiring would sort of moot the point of Exago session. So with that, I just want to say thanks for attending the lab today. I hope you folks found it really informative. If you do have any other questions, of course, you can always email services@exagoinc.com or post a item on our support site. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much and happy reporting.